Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm your host, Aya Takase, and I am here with our presenters. The co-presenter, Simon Bates, will facilitate the Q&A sessions, and we have two experts, Piero Lagmaris and Amy Syverson, as speakers. Thank you for joining our webinar series, Enhancing Pharma Process with X-ray, Thermal, and Raman Analysis Tools. In this webinar series, we will discuss various practical analytical techniques and their applications to enhance pharmaceutical research and quality control. The episodes are organized by the different stages of research and production. In this first episode, we will cover analytical techniques related to discovery. But before we start, a few housekeeping items. This is going to be an interactive session, and I will be posting relevant links in the chat window. And we'll be taking your questions live during the webcast and answering them during the session, so please don't wait until the end to ask. Please submit those questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will not be monitoring the raise the hand function. We will try to answer as many questions as we can during the webinar, and we will respond to any unanswered questions directly after the session is complete. Now, if for whatever reason you have a difficulty viewing the webinar live, please note it is being recorded and you will be able to view the recording beginning tomorrow. Now, with that said, let me give the floor to Simon.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you all for attending. To set the stage for this webinar series that tracks the discovery and development of new drug products. Today, we find ourselves within the discovery area where we have some target site identified already on a protein, an enzyme, or a gene. And this target site is associated with the pathology that we're trying to address with this particular drug product we're developing. And so we're in discovery, we're looking at lead generation for small molecules or linkers that attach to the target site. So that's where we are today. And Pierre will start us off and he'll talk a little bit about single crystal structure analysis, how to get the structure, how to understand how that can lead you to the conclusions for how is it going to attach to the target sites associated with the pathology. And then following Pierre, we'll move on to Amy, and she'll talk about stock solution management, which is a key part of enabling the whole discovery process itself. So having said that, I'll pass you across to Pierre to talk about single crystal structure solution analysis.
Thank you, Aya and Simon, and welcome everyone to our Pharma webinar series. So this first episode is devoted to discovery, like Aya and Simon just said, and the discovery step of drug research. In the first part of today's episode, I'll be talking about the ultimate method for characterizing new compounds, and this is called single crystal crystallography. I am a crystallographer myself here at Rigaku, and my job today is to explain how powerful it can be to know the crystal structure of a compound within the frame of drug discovery. So the agenda will be as follows. In the first part, I will explain what crystal structures are and the critical information they provide about the structure of the molecules, but also the molecules in their crystal form. The second part, we'll discuss the analytical tool that allows to determine crystal structures, namely single crystal X-ray crystallography. And that second part will be focused on the use of X-rays. In the third part, we'll go one step further and talk about electron crystallography. And so we will see how electron crystallography, also called micro-ED, can save the day sometimes when X-ray crystallography fails. So let me start by pointing to one of the main problems in drug research, besides money, of course, and that is time. So we know that time can be lost when you try to unambiguously characterize new compounds. And here I'm talking about structurally characterizing the compound, what your molecule looks like, and what the crystal looks like, the crystals of your molecule looks like. I am not talking about characterizing the properties of new compounds, such as solubility. So here, this is time loss when trying to fully characterize your compound. If you can't crystallize it, then you're likely to lose more time trying one of the following steps, scaling it up, whatever small amount you may have, then purifying it, and maybe even crystallizing it. And lastly, we know that time can be lost also looking for the presence of polymorphs. If you find any, trying to characterize each of them, and so that you are able to select the best one. So you may use analytical methods such as NMR, FTIR, or solid-state powder measurement, but those do not have all the answers. For instance, you cannot get the absolute configuration of a chiral drug candidate just from an NMR spectrum. And sometimes you have too little amounts of sample to run any of these analyses anyway. And the last thing I'm going to say is that those measurements like NMR, FTIR, and so on are made on bulk materials, which means that you measure on everything you've got in your sample, including impurities, polymorphs, side products of your synthesis, starting materials that did not react the whole lot. And of course, trying to characterize the compound you're looking for when you have to deal with data from many species at once, it becomes even harder. So now that we've set up time loss as the background for this first presentation today, we thought we would ask the audience here our first polling question.
Okay, so let me start the polling question. So the question we wanted to ask the audience is, how much time you think is lost characterizing compounds and polymorphs? You have the following choices. You might be losing weeks, months, or maybe even years, or you might say, I'm not wasting any time. The answers are coming in fast. I'm gonna give you a few more seconds to think. And I'll be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's share the results. So many people said a month.
Yeah,
47% month and 24% weeks and years.
I guess that's realistic, but that's definitely quite a time sink spent on doing polymorph searching and trying to identify what you have. That's interesting information.
Yeah, even years. Okay. All right. So then that's the point of this presentation today. And let me try to explain to you how you can mitigate all this time loss by determining the crystal structure of your new compounds. So you can do that because crystal structures are the only results that really give you a clear picture of the molecules in their pure crystal form. So there are three concepts here. There's the picture of the molecules themselves, the picture of the molecules in the crystal form, and then the fact that the crystal forms are pure. So let's try to investigate these three concepts a bit more. Let's start with the picture of the molecule. The picture of the molecule is when each and every atom can be located and identified. On the picture that you see right now on your screen, this is the crystal structure of a molecule of acetaminophen, also known as paracetamol. So the gray ellipsoids here represent carbon atoms. The white ones represent hydrogens. The two red ellipsoids represent oxygen atoms, and the sole blue ellipsoid here is an atom of nitrogen. So once you have been able to locate all your atoms and identify them, you can see how they link with each other to make up a molecule. And we call that molecular connectivity. So this is really as if you had made yourself really small and gone into your crystal and taken a picture of the molecules with your camera. You actually have a clear picture of the molecule. So next, a crystal form. So the crystal form is how molecules arrange with each other in a periodic way to form a crystal. The picture you see on your screen shows how the molecules of acetaminophen arrange in this specific crystal form or polymorph. And you see that if you follow the vertical axis or the horizontal axis, the same molecules repeat each other in a periodic way. And here is another view of the same molecular arrangement, just seen from a different perspective. But again, periodicity here, and the molecules arrange themselves in all three directions of space, always the same way. Now, there are exceptions to this periodicity. There are crystals that are crystals indeed, but in which the molecules are not arranged in a periodic way, but this is beyond the scope of this presentation today. So anyway, this is what we call crystal packing, and the crystal packing leads to the crystal form or to the polymorph. And then why do we say that crystals are pure? Well, this is because a crystal represents a specific arrangement of molecules. So here are some pictures of nice-looking crystals. And when I say crystals, this is what I'm talking about. Here, each one of these little bits on the left-hand side, for instance, that I'm surrounding now with my cursor. So each one of these crystals represents a specific arrangement of molecules, meaning a specific crystal form or a specific polymorph. Now, they can be made of molecules from the same compounds or different compounds, even including solvent molecules, doesn't matter. And each one of these crystals can also be made of a different molecular arrangement. But each individual crystal is made only on one specific molecular arrangement, meaning each crystal is specific to a polymorph. Again, there are some exceptions to this rule with polycrystalline materials and so, like thin film, but this is also beyond the scope of this presentation today. So now that we've investigated what these three concepts are, let's see what kind of information you can get from your crystal structure. And let's talk first about molecular connectivity. Again, remember the picture of your molecule. Obviously, you can unambiguously identify your compound. You know exactly what it is and how it is made of. Then you can also determine the absolute configuration of a chiral compound. There is a picture of the molecule of tyrosine. The green arrow points to a chiral carbon. That gray ellipsoid, once more, is carbon. And so it's 4 different chemical groups are bound to that carbon. And once you have located or identified these 4 groups and you see their arrangement around the chiral center, then you can also determine the absolute configuration of your molecule or its handedness. And obviously, the success of a chiral drug candidate depends on its handedness. So you want to get one of the isomers, but not the other. And the crystal structure of your compound will tell you which of the isomers that you've got. You can also distinguish between salts and co-crystals. So here is an example of 2 molecules co-crystallizing with each other. On that picture that you see right now, those 2 molecules are in their neutral state. Therefore, we call that a co-crystal. However, the same 2 molecules can also co-crystallize as a salt. How do we know that? Just by the one little difference, the position of that hydrogen atom that I'm surrounding with my cursor here at the bottom right of your screen. So you see that on the bottom picture, that hydrogen is linked to the nitrogen atom here, the blue ellipsoid, which makes the molecule on the left-hand side bear a positive charge. As a result, the molecule on the right-hand side now bears a negative charge. We have now a co-crystal between a cation and an anion. Therefore, we've got a salt. So usually, not every time though, but usually you can indeed determine the position of all your hydrogen atoms. If you can't, that's dependent on the data, the quality of the data coming out of your crystal, of course, but oftentimes you can indeed locate all your hydrogens. And lastly, you can also use a crystal structure to determine as to whether a drug candidate has inserted itself within the active site of a target protein. On your screen right now, you see the picture or the crystal structure of the protein catalase, and that picture represents the active site of that protein with the presence of the heme ligand here in the active site of that protein. In the same vein, crystal structures of complexes between target proteins and drug candidates may be also able to show whether the drug candidate has managed to reach the active site of that protein. And if so, how then it binds with the amino acids making up the active site pocket. And as a result, single crystal structure determination is critical to screening drug candidates with target proteins and therefore widely used in structural biology. Let's move on to crystal packing now. It is by studying the crystal packing that you can assess as to whether solvent or water molecules have been caught within the crystal lattice. And here is an example of it. Two different molecules, which I'm surrounding with my cursor here and one there, have co-crystallized by catching a few water molecules within the crystal lattice. So here, the crystal structure, again, told us that we have a hydrate. And next, crystal packing obviously will also tell you whether you have polymorphs and which ones they are. So if I expand on the same two molecules, so it's almost the same compound as the one I showed on the previous slide. Actually, on the previous slide, I showed the compound, the co-crystals, with the water molecules in the crystal lattice. Turns out that the same two molecules, I repeat, the same two molecules, this one here and that one there, can also co-crystallize, but this time without water molecules, any water molecules within the crystal lattice. Okay? And here you have two different polymorphs, one that is a hydrate and the other one that is an anhydrate. And obviously, this is critical also for drug research to know which one you've got. So there you have it, the main types of information that can be derived from crystal structures. So unambiguous compound identification, absolute configuration determination, distinguishing between salts and co-crystals, assessing as to whether a drug candidate has reached the active site of a protein, whether you have a hydrate or a solvate or not, and whether you have polymorphs and what they are. I think this is a good time maybe to make a little stop and take questions about crystal structures in general, if there are any already, Aya.
Yes, Pierre, this time we have one question coming from the audience. And of course, I have many questions if we have time. But for the audience first, if a synthesis yields an unexpected product or the starting materials did not react with each other, will I get crystals of those unexpected compounds?
Most likely, yes. And I say most likely, it's all depends as to whether those species can crystallize when they are in that specific environment. And by environment, I mean that specific solution. So it may be that a compound is too soluble in that solution, and so it will not crystallize. But so this is the only uncertainty. But as soon as an unexpected compound can indeed crystallize also, then you will find it within the multitude of crystals that come out of your solution. And this is only a question of time for you to actually catch it and realize that, well, you have that species in your sample as well.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Pierre. I haven't got time for one more question, and we have one more coming in. And I definitely encourage you all listening to please submit some questions. Don't be shy. And the next one says, I've had some examples where another method would suggest a certain molecular structure, but the crystal structure would show a slightly different molecule. Which should I believe?
So like I said, the crystal structure is the ultimate answer. You take a picture of your crystal. If this is not the exact same things that you're getting from another method, maybe NMR also, well, it may be that somehow you made a mistake or you couldn't really draw that conclusion from the NMR spectrum. You were maybe unsure also, and so then turn to the crystal structure to get the final answer. I will go back to the example I showed about that one hydrogen atom that was linked to one molecule or the other, and according to where it was how to say, it would give rise to either a co-crystal of neutral molecules or the crystal of a salt. So that position of the hydrogen, you may not be able to determine it for sure, at least by NMR. The crystal structure will show you exactly where it is. So again, so not to put down other methods, but usually if you are lucky enough to get a good enough crystals and get a single crystal structure, that's it. That's your final answer.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, crystallography, single crystal structures are usually taken to be the gold standard within pharmaceutics.
The only thing, Simon, is sometimes, especially with proteins, enzymes, viruses,
yeah, right.
that you may have different conformations in solution because of the flexibility that some molecules may have in solution, whereas they no longer have that flexibility in the crystal. And out of all these conformations, there might be only one that can crystallize, as a result, you have only one result from the crystal structure, but you have other conformations present in solution. And especially in the macromolecule world, this is an unending debate, right? But at least the structure, what you have in that crystal structure, cannot be wrong. You may not be able to capture all the species you had in solution, especially those that could not crystallize. But once those that can crystallize, that's it. It is the crystal structure. It is what it is.
That's right. Thanks again, Pierre. We've had a lot of questions coming in now.
Okay.
We should actually, if you can address one of them really quickly. We had a few coming in about enantiomeric purity. How can you be sure that crystals are enantiomerically pure, so single-handed crystals?
So actually, this is part of your structure refinements. You actually refine whether you use X-rays or electrons, and I'm going to go into that a bit later now. So you can actually calculate statistics from your diffraction data that will, and the results of these calculations will tell you whether you have one isomer or the other.
That's great. Yeah, there are a lot more questions, but we should probably move on in the interest of time.
Okay.
And we can address the other questions by email later.
Absolutely.
That works. Okay, great. Thanks.
So now let me move on to the next part of my talk. There are three of them all together. And I'll explain the basics of really the beautiful tool that we have at hand to determine crystal structures. And that tool is called single crystal crystallography. So that second part will be about X-rays, and the next part will be about electrons. And so before I get into that, again, let's make a little break here, and because we don't really know how familiar this audience is with crystallography. This is a big deal for us, and therefore we wanted to ask you the second and last question for my part.
So let me launch the second question from Pierre. So he wanted to ask the audience, how often do you use single crystal crystallography to characterize your compounds? Your choices are often, occasionally, or I don't use this technique. The answers are coming in. It's pretty evenly split.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna give you a few more seconds. Okay, I think most of the audience answered the question. So I'm gonna close it in 3, 2, 1. Gonna end the poll and share the results. So often 28%, occasionally 39%, and I don't use this technique was 33%.
Okay, so quite a lot of people using it never actually, or just occasionally, right? So again, good. That's the point of this webinar today, or of this episode. So then, let me give you some more explanations about how X-ray crystallography works. Then, so X-ray crystallography. So you start with an X-ray beam that you need to have as monochromatic and focused on a crystal. Here is the crystal here, mounted itself on what we call a goniometer head. And the whole thing is mounted on what is called an X-ray diffractometer. So the interactions of the incoming X-ray beam with the electrons within your crystal will give rise to discrete reflections. So of course, these reflections come out of the crystal in all directions of space, but we record them on a 2D detector. So on that detector, we record both the location of the reflections and we integrate their intensity. And then we rotate that crystal in the beam. Instead of moving the detector around the crystal, we actually rotate the crystal in the beam to gather all the reflections that come out of that are coming out of the crystal. So we put all this information into mathematical calculations, which are called a Fourier transform, and we get back a so-called electron density map. And the maxima on this electron density map gives you a molecular model of your compound. So if you want to learn more about X-ray crystallography, I strongly suggest that you read this book. It's not very big. Crystallography Made Crystal Clear. It's really nice. It explains things really nicely, and it's written for beginners. So this is how X-ray crystallography work, and the instruments that allows you to do X-ray crystallography are called X-ray diffractometers. And this is where manufacturers like Rigaku come in. We build diffractometers and provide the software and the hardware to collect data and solve structures. And you do the crystal or the crystals. So crystals for X-ray crystallography need to be at least 1 micron in dimensions and can be up to a few hundreds of microns. As soon as you can grow a compound in a good enough crystal, nothing great, just a crystal of okay quality, this is what an X-ray crystallography experiment should look like. On the left-hand side, you see the diffraction images that the detector collects. Those white dots are the discrete reflections I mentioned a minute ago. And while the crystal is being rotated in the beam, the diffraction patterns changes from image to image. The location of those reflections are being recorded, their intensity integrated, and that's what's going on the right-hand side of your screen via what is called data reduction. And once the whole thing is done, then hopefully you get a crystal structure or a good enough model to go on and finish the obtaining the crystal structure from your compound. This model here that you see on the right-hand side can be whole, meaning you've got already all the non-hydrogen atoms of your molecules. It can also be partial, not to worry at all. What you do then is that, or what crystallographers do, is that they refine whatever model they have currently, look again at what is called the electron density map, or in this case, the residual electron density map. And hopefully there are a few more maxima in that electron density map that corresponds to the atoms that have not been assigned yet. So they enter those atoms, refine the model again, and so on and so forth, build up their molecule little by little, step by step, all the way up until they see solvent molecules, if there are any, and even hydrogen atoms. So step by step. Now, of course, crystals don't always appear so nicely, and then there are two main criteria that affect the quality of your crystals. This is how tight molecules are packed inside crystals, and then the size of those crystals. So if I get back to the picture of this polymorph of acetaminophen, it's easy to understand how a small and flat molecule like this can pack pretty tightly in the crystal. But of course, it's also easy to understand that the size and shape of the molecules to crystallize will influence the tightness of the crystal packing. The bulkier the molecules, or even the more the longer the molecules, meaning the more flexible they are in solution, and the harder is going to pack them tightly in a crystal. And as a result, the crystal quality, or your crystal is more fragile, and the crystal quality is lower. Same goes if you have presence of solvent molecules in the crystal, and if voids are being left in between molecules in the crystal form. The other main criterion decreasing the quality of your crystal, or the quality of the diffraction data that you may collect, is of course the size of the crystal. And here I have a picture of a small crystal. You see that little dark rod here is really small. The length of that crystal is okay, actually 45 microns, but the cross section is only 13 microns by 13 microns. And sometimes that's all you've got. You can't crystallize crystals in larger dimensions, and sometimes you're even stuck with no crystals at all. All you have is a powder, a crystalline precipitate. So that's why manufacturers like Rigaku manufacture X-ray diffractometers that generate X-ray beams of different strength. So here, moving from the left to the right, we move through stronger and stronger X-ray beams, all the way to even using synchrotron beamlines. And as crystallographers use stronger and stronger beams, they can analyze smaller and smaller and smaller crystals as I move from left to right again, all the way down to crystals that are, like I said once already, dimensions of about 1 micron. And there you hit a wall. So unfortunately, 1 micron is about the smallest crystal size X-ray crystallography can handle. And below that dimension, one must really turn to electron diffraction. And that's because the interactions of electrons with crystalline matter are much stronger than the interactions of X-ray photons with crystalline matter, really by up to 5 or 6 orders of magnitude. And that's why, as a sudden, with an electron beam, you can analyze submicron particles. And that leads me to the very last part of my presentation here. How does electron diffraction works, and what can you do really with it? So on the left-hand side, you have a picture of the Rigaku electron diffractometer, the Synergy ED. And I can certainly answer questions about that later if you want. Now, using an electron diffractometer mostly has two main advantages: crystal size and the amount of sample that you can then use for analysis. As I said on my previous slide, so you can now analyze submicron crystals. But think about what that means. That means that now you can do single crystal crystallography on a crystalline powder. No more need to actually dance around with different solvent conditions to try to get crystals. A crystalline powder will suffice. And then as a result, since you need one or a handful of submicron particles to get the crystal structure, you can work with tiny amounts of powders. Okay? And really those very first solids that you may get sometimes when you try for the first time to synthesize a new compound, you may not get much of these very first solids. Then and you don't have enough again to do NMR, FTIR, and so on. Think about electron diffraction. Give us one particle, and that might suffice for us to give you back a crystal structure. Okay. So here is a few examples of powder samples that we worked with: tyrosine on the left-hand side, organic core crystal in the middle, and a metal organic framework on the right-hand side. And typically, people will use transmission electron microscope, like the one shown on the bottom right of your screen, with a diameter of about 3 millimeters. And people will actually sweep that TEM grid inside that powder sample, and therefore get a multitude of nanocrystals on their grid. Then you load that into an electron diffractometer, and that's what you see. So from that tyrosine sample, this is a tiny particle on which we collected diffraction images. So given that circle represents a diameter of 2 microns at sample position, that particle here is less than half a micron in size. And this is an example of the diffraction pattern, beautiful diffraction pattern that we got out of it. And I mentioned here, though, that this is just one image from a series of several hundreds of rotational consecutive images, right? So just like with X-rays, we do rotate the sample in the beam, and then we gather hundreds of images. This is just one example. And then we got the crystal structure of tyrosine in it. So this is what we got for tyrosine. For the organic core crystal, here are examples of particles that we used and diffraction patterns we got, and the same for the MOF sample here. Look at this beautiful diffraction pattern at the bottom. And one last example of a zirconium coordination compound. I don't have a picture of the powder for that sample, but I still showed it here because of that beautiful, very thin needle at the top right of your screen. The thickness of that needle is probably 50 nanometers or less, and yet we got a beautiful diffraction pattern and the crystal structure. So if you want to learn more about electron diffraction, I suggest that you read this review that some of my colleagues at Rigaku wrote a couple of years ago. And the very last thing I want to add and finish there with electron diffraction is that, remember, you've got a multitude of nanocrystals at once on the grid. And so now, as a sudden, you can do high throughput screening of polymorphs on these powder samples. And this is how it should look like. So using the software, you would put a bunch of nanocrystals that look good to you in a queue. And then you ask the crystal to go back to each one of these nanocrystals one by one, auto-center it, and auto-collect a data set on it. And of course, data reduction is done behind the scenes as well. So you put a bunch of, or maybe a few hundreds of such nanoparticles in the queue, run it overnight or for a few hours. And when you come back to the machine, hopefully you have a few hundreds of data sets with their unit cell parameters, and maybe even with several structures, and you can identify whether you have polymorphs and if so, what they are. And again, this is really important at any stage of drug research, including for those very first solids that you get when you first try to crystallize new compounds. Remember, just one or a couple of those submicron particles may suffice to get a crystal structure. And I can now get to my conclusion and leave the floor to Amy in a few minutes. So I hope I have convinced you of the power that knowing the crystal structure can have. I will remind you that you can unambiguously determine the molecular connectivity and crystal form of your compounds. You can determine as to whether you have a hydrate or a solvate, whether you have a salt or a co-crystal, what the absolute configuration of your molecule is, and whether you have polymorphs, and if so, what they are. And really, you understand that the earlier in the process that you can get crystal structures of your compounds, the more you may be able to mitigate time loss. And those months and years that were mentioned in the poll a few minutes ago, hopefully it comes down to a few days or a couple of weeks, and that is it. And I'm going to stop here, maybe take a few questions if we have time, or otherwise give the floor to Amy.
Yeah, we have time for a couple of questions, and we have a few more coming in. Let's have this one. So does the absolute structure change during data reduction and or absorption correction?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Can't be. So remember that the absolute structure is in the data that you collected. Once you have collected the data, you can't change them. And so this is the results that you will get is what it is in the in your molecule. So if you determine a certain isomer in your sample, this is what it is. I mean, nothing when structure nothing that you may have done when refining the structure that should have changed that.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about like electron diffraction. When we go through the dynamic pipeline, we have to go through the processing before we really know what the handedness of the molecule is.
Absolutely. It can be, especially with electron diffraction, because now you're dealing with such tiny particles, it can be a little bit involved to determine the handedness of your molecule. We do that via that so-called dynamical refinements, which are performed in a program called YANA. And so sometimes, you refine more and more of the parameters of your crystal structure, and sometimes you have to go pretty far in those refinements to finally have an answer, and that may take a few days, okay, depending on the calculating power of your computer. But then, from the very first refinements that you run, you may be able to already distinguish the results for each enantiomer, and then you can quickly determine as to which handedness or which enantiomer you've got. Okay, so but it does involve some calculations in data.
Okay, that's great. Thanks again, Pierre. I think we should probably move on, I think, to Amy's presentation.
Okay, thank you, Pierre. If you have any questions for him, I'm going to put his email address in the chat so that you can contact with him directly after the webinar.
Hi, I'm Amy Syverson. I'm the general manager for Ragaku Reagents. Today I'm here to talk to you about stock solutions and your lab. During this session, we're going to talk about the best practices for managing your stock solution inventory and how to make best use of your time and keeping projects to run smoothly. So during this webinar, you're going to hear me refer to the term stock solutions often. These categories are essential for many laboratory settings. This is just kind of a high-level classification system that we use in our lab. They can be organized in many other ways, but we have like your basic salt solutions, ammonium chlorides, lithium sulfates, and so on. Your buffers, common ones that we see are tris and heaps, and these are to maintain a stable pH value. Precipitants, and then prepared reagent solutions are often multiple component solutions where there'll be a buffer and maybe a precipitant and a salt in that. These are used to kind of facilitate controlled reactions. So having stock solutions readily available is going to be one of the best ways to improve efficiency in your lab work. Stock solutions, especially buffers, are often needed in multiple steps throughout an experiment. The beauty of preparing these ahead of time is that you're always ready to go when it's time to conduct your work without having to mix each solution from scratch. So this simple step will save you a lot of valuable time, will help reduce errors and ensure consistency across all of your experiments. So when you're running experiments, either by hand or if you're using a liquid handling instrument, it's very important to plan ahead. So you will need to know the exact concentrations of the solutions you're using, the volumes of each of those solutions, and if there's any specific container requirements or any like additional supplies that are needed. This is the time. Make sure that you're ready to go. The timing matters a lot with a lot of the experiments that you're running. And so just a little bit of prep work ahead of time is going to save a huge hassle later on. Keeping your lab stocked with the right solutions isn't always as simple as just like putting in an order and having them show up. There's a lot of things that go into stock solution management, maintaining a dry chemical inventory, making sure that you have what you need, that orders are arriving in time. But then comes the real work of having to measure out everything, making sure that everything's dissolved and pH'd properly, and then labeling and storing and tracking it all. It's a big process. Staying on top is going to ensure that things continue to run smoothly. If you don't have a solid plan for maintaining your lab stock solutions, things may get chaotic very fast. Running out of chemicals, mislabeling solutions, or losing track of what's in storage, it can all add up to a lot of frustration and wasted time. So just, again, a little bit of planning will help just make sure that things are running smoothly. One of the best ways to avoid running out of chemicals is by keeping an accurate logbook or a digital record. So it's going to be important that you're keeping track of the chemicals that are being used to prevent running into expired stock solutions or running out. You want to predict the size of the batches you'll need for all upcoming experiments. And that way you can prepare the right size and you're not having to make the same chemical day after day. And you'll always want to prioritize the solution that was made the longest time ago to ensure that you're using up all of that before you use a newer batch. So that way you aren't wasting a lot of chemical that may get pushed in the back of your inventory and become expired or no longer good. Contamination is also a risk that can be avoided by using aseptic techniques, avoiding the amount of times that you're opening and closing a bottle will help with that. So I'm going to take a minute here to ask the audience the first polling question.
Okay, so we have the first question from Amy. Let me start it. Okay, so the question is, which vendor do you purchase stock solutions from? So we have a couple of choices: Rigaku Reagents, Hampton Research, Molecular Dimensions, and Sigma Aldrich, or you might use something else, or you might not purchase stock solutions. So for those, we have other as your choice. Okay, answers are coming in. One manufacturer is very popular. You're not seeing the results, I'm teasing you. I'm gonna give you a few more seconds. Okay, so I'm gonna close the polling in 3, 2, 1, and share the results. So about close to 70% said Sigma Aldrich and 30% other. Because hopefully, Amy, you're going to change some people's mind about your stock solutions.
And that's, please feel free to share any thoughts with us that you have, whether it's if you've ever used Rigaku reagent solution or your current vendors. If there's something that you're looking for and don't see, please feel free to contact us at any time. In the next few slides, we'll dive into the 5 best practices to kind of help avoid some of the chaos with stock solution management. The first practice is knowing your lab's needs. So tracking and understanding consumption needs for each upcoming project is going to be crucial. Again, the types of stock solutions needed, volumes of each of those containers that will be needed is going to be important to know so that you're ready to go. Monitoring your usage patterns over time. This will help identify your overall usage, noting if there's any fluctuations. Say you had a project going on last year that you know will not continue. You may notice that you'll have a decrease in that stock solution, or vice versa. You may have something coming up that you didn't, and you'll need to prepare for that better. Also, establishing a clear definition of when your lab considers empty. So you don't want to get down to when you're completely out, because then at that point you'll have to go, start prepping, continue to run your experiment. So planning for your lab's future needs is we'll anticipate any upcoming requirements. This is for equipment, supplies, and resources that will be needed. This will help ensure that you're prepared for growth, if there's any changes in the upcoming schedule. And laying these out across multiple instruments will help you get a clear view of future resources that will be needed so that you can better prepare for demand. So in our lab, we know that we will be running machines constantly, week after week. And it's helpful for us to be able to take a look and see what solutions are being used and make larger batch sizes of chemicals at one time. The third best practice is to keep an eye on your inventory regularly. So here is an example of an online inventory tracker. This may be something useful to quickly reference the inventory you have in your lab. So once you know what solutions you'll need in the future, you can go in and compare to what you already have or figure out what chemicals you'll need to order and to prepare. It's also important here, you can note specific CAS numbers, or if there's a specific grade of chemical that you need, you can make note of it here. So staying on top of your inventory is going to be key to keeping up with the demand of the different stock solutions. So whether your lab uses like handwritten lists, Excel files, or maybe something more advanced, it's essential that you're keeping it accurate. A lot of times we forget, if maybe something became contaminated, it's important to go back and check that out of your inventory so that you don't go to use it in the future and then forget that it was disposed. We're going to link here a very good, just a basic inventory management tool that you may want to check out and look into for your lab. Another handy tool is a recipe repository. So it's super important to have a designated spot where you can store and update stock solution recipes. When preparing stock solutions, it's a good idea to document weight and volumes of each chemical that are used, keeping track of catalog numbers, vendors, lot numbers. And that way, if something goes wrong or if something goes right, you're able to go back and trace the material that's used. Some chemicals have specific requirements for dissolving properly or for them to be able to reach a specific pH. So having a place for notes on that stuff is really useful. You can also include any necessary PPE requirements to ensure that everything's safe and consistent. So team standards are essential for keeping everyone on the same page. This will also help reduce any mistakes and improve workflow. Setting team standards will help new team members who come on board to get up to speed quickly and have a smooth transition. So I'm sure we've all worked in an environment where maybe one team member is working on something and becomes ill or has something come up, and they're not able to make it in or complete a task, and you're asked to take over. So that's where it's really important to have everything documented, knowing where they left off and what needs to be done to complete the task. Maintaining consistent logs and recipe files further supports the accurate preparation of stock solutions. Regular inventory checks guarantee that the material ordered will be here in advance for when it's needed. And then just by establishing clear team standards, consistency and efficiency just become the foundation of the team's operations. So we've been doing this for now over 25 years. And so these are really tried and true techniques that have worked for us. We inventory over 200 unique solutions that we use to run on our liquid handling machines to produce a lot of like the wizard screens and such that we offer. So I have one last question for the audience.
Okay, let me start the last polling question. Okay, so the question is, do you use any type of liquid handling instrumentation in your lab? You might say yes, no, or you might say, I don't know. So you have those three choices. I thought it was going to be kind of split, but yeah, it is a split. I'm going to give you a few more seconds to answer. Okay, then I'm going to close the polling in 3, 2, 1. And let me share the results. So 50% of the audience said yes, they use a certain type of liquid handling instrumentation, and 31% said no, and 19% said I don't know.
Well, yeah, liquid handling instruments can definitely enhance research efficiency and accuracy. However, their performance is heavily dependent on having that constant supply of stock solutions. Inadequate or inconsistent stock solution supply can lead to errors or can compromise data and potentially lead to more downstream issues. So that's where stock solution management is very important. So some of the key takeaways, lab work can be very time sensitive. So rushing to meet deadlines, especially when running multiple experiments, often results in making mistakes or creating maybe some chaotic conditions. Having those stock solutions available on hand will allow you to quickly follow up on any results that you may get. In labs where maybe there's multiple experiments running on a daily basis, time is crucial. So having those stock solutions available ahead of time, you can focus more on the core activities of your experiment instead of stock solution preparation. In high throughput labs, stock solutions provide immediate access to the materials that are needed, which is essential for maintaining a smooth workflow and ensuring that experiments can go on without having any delays. Solutions that are prepared, stored, and used consistently help ensure that your experiments are more reliable. You have the ready-to-use solutions and remove any variables that may lead to any inconsistencies when you're mixing solutions every time. All right, and I'll open this up to any questions there may have.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Yeah, we have one question from the audience at this point. How do you know when to set an expiration date for a chemical you make?
So there's different areas where the manufacturers maybe could provide, it'll be on a label when you order the chemical. You may reference the SDS or the certificate of analysis. Sometimes they will have recommendations, or depending upon the chemical, it will also vary. It's important that you are using the notes of how to store those chemicals to ensure that you get the longest shelf life out of those chemicals.
That's great, thanks. You know, I was thinking to the last poll question about liquid handling. You know, I'd have thought that having liquid handling would allow you to keep a more accurate track of the stock solution inventory that you have. I mean, how do you keep track of the inventory if you don't have any automated liquid handling or something like that?
That's where it's just important to document, the batches of each solution that you're making, and then try to maintain what is being used. Because even if you're just pouring it out and using it on the lab bench, it's just important to track that.
Oh, okay, that's great, thanks. And you already addressed the question on shelf life. Another question that came in was concerning purity. I mean, is there a way of determining the purity of the stock solutions that you get?
Yeah, so that should also be documented on the certificate of analysis that you should receive from the vendors who you're purchasing it through.
Okay, well, thank you again, Amy. There are no more questions coming through at this particular time.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you, Simon, and thank you, Amy. If you have any more questions for Amy, I put her email address in the chat so you can connect with her directly. Okay.
Yes, please send in questions. We always like to hear from everybody. So please feel free to send in something to us. This would be great. Thank you. And thank you all for attending.
Okay, so as I said earlier, a recording of the webinar will be available tomorrow, and an email will go out to all registrants with a link to the recording page. And links to the resources mentioned today you saw in the chat, and also the slide deck will become available on the same recording page. And please don't forget to register for the next episode. I put a link to the next episode registration page. So next month, we will be talking about preclinical development and pre-formulation, and we'll discuss thermal analysis and powder X-ray diffraction techniques. Okay, well, thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye for now.
Yeah.